She was forced to say goodbye to her grandmother forever, until she stood up in court and revealed the unthinkable. The courtroom was filled, yet the air was so thick with silence that it felt suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present, but no one felt it as deeply as the small girl gripping her grandmother's hand. She was only 10, but in that moment she felt much older. Her tiny fingers clung to the frail hand beside her, as if letting go would mean losing everything. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild rhythm of fear, anger, and helplessness. Her grandmother, seated beside her, looked small, too small for the towering wooden chair she occupied. Her silver hair was neatly combed, her best dress carefully pressed, but none of that could hide the exhaustion in her face. Her hands trembled in her lap, clutching a handkerchief she had carried for years. The judge, an older man with deep lines carved into his face, sighed as he reached for his pen. The legal documents before him outlined a simple order. The little girl would be taken from her grandmother's care and placed into foster care. A clean, official decision. The grandmother had fought hard, pleaded, cried, even begged. But the court had been convinced. The social worker's reports had been clear. She forgets things too often. She's too weak to care for a child. The girl needs stability. The social worker didn't know the truth. The judge didn't know the truth. No one did. But sitting a few rows back, watching with satisfaction, was the man responsible for it all. Rick. He sat with his arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he would finally make her pay. And he knew that once the judge signed that paper, there would be no going back. But he had underestimated one thing. The little girl wasn't ready to give up. Rick Holloway sat in the back of the courtroom, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. His eyes stayed fixed on the frail woman in the front row. Margaret didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. He knew she could feel his presence, like a cold wind creeping in through a crack in the window. It had taken years, but finally, she was about to lose everything. Rick hadn't always been the enemy. There was a time when Margaret trusted him, when she believed he was just a hardworking man who needed a chance. He had been the one she called when the sink leaked, when the front steps needed repair, when heavy groceries had to be carried up the stairs. She had treated him well. And that had been her mistake, because kindness had made her blind. She didn't notice the missing bills from her purse. She ignored the misplaced jewelry, the strange gaps in her cabinets where silverware used to be. She assumed she was just getting forgetful until the pattern became too obvious to ignore. One evening, she stood in the kitchen, her voice shaking but firm. "I know what you've been doing, Rick." Rick had chuckled at first, shaking his head as if she were speaking nonsense. But then he saw in her eyes certainty. And that's when his smile vanished. She didn't fall for his excuses. She didn't let him twist her doubts back onto herself. By the end of the night, he was gone. Margaret had made sure of that. She called the police, reported the thefts, warned the neighbors. And just like that, his world collapsed. No more easy money, no more trust, no more slipping in and out of houses unnoticed, pocketing valuables here and there. Rick lost everything. And in his mind, it was all because of her. She had ruined him, and for that she would pay, so he waited. For years, he stayed in the shadows, watching as time did its work. Margaret got older, slower, weaker, and when the moment was right, he returned. Not with anger, not with threats, but with a smile, because this time, he had a plan. Margaret never thought she would see Rick Holloway again. It had been years since she forced him out of her life. Years since she warned the neighborhood about him. Time had passed, and with it, she had let herself believe that chapter was closed. Then, one morning, he was there, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, hands stuffed into his pockets, his head slightly bowed, as if weighed down by shame. Margaret froze in the doorway, her heart pounding. "I know I'm the last person you want to see," Rick said, his voice softer than she remembered. "But I just wanted to say I'm sorry." She didn't respond. "I was a fool back then," he continued. "A desperate man who made bad choices. And I paid for them." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I lost everything, Margaret. My reputation, my home, my dignity." Margaret's fingers tightened on the door frame. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, looking up at her now. "I've been trying to turn my life around. I got clean. I've been working, helping at the church, volunteering when I can. I know I can't erase the past, but I had to come back and tell you I regret it. All of it." The years had aged him. His once dark hair was streaked with gray. His face, always so sharp and calculating, looked weary now. There was no arrogance in his posture, no sign of the man who had once laughed at her accusations. Margaret had always believed in second chances. Still, she hesitated. "I don't need anything from you," Rick added quickly. "Just wanted you to know I'm not that man anymore." Margaret studied his face. Was it possible? Could a man like Rick truly change? Against every instinct, she took a small step forward. "If you're telling the truth," she said, her voice careful, "then I'm glad." Rick nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll leave you be," he said, stepping away. But as he turned, Margaret did something she would later regret. She called after him. "If you really have changed," she said, "maybe you'd like to come by sometime. I could use some help around the house." Rick paused, and then, ever so slowly, he smiled. At first, Rick was cautious. He came by only once a week, always careful to stay polite, never pushing too far. He fixed a broken step on the porch, replaced a loose cabinet hinge, and even offered to take Margaret's trash bins down to the curb on collection day. Margaret remained wary, but with time, her grip on the past loosened. The man who had once stolen from her seemed different now, older, humbler. And then there was Lily. Her granddaughter had always been shy around strangers, but Rick had a way of making her laugh. He would carve little animals out of wood scraps and leave them on the table for her to find. One day, he brought over an old harmonica and played a clumsy, out-of-tune melody, making Lily giggle so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Margaret watched them from the kitchen, a strange warmth growing in her chest. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe time really had changed Rick. So when he started stopping by more often, she didn't object. When he offered to pick up groceries for her, she gave him a list. And when he asked if she needed help managing her bills, she hesitantly let him see the stack of envelopes sitting by the phone. He never asked for anything in return. That was what made it easy to trust him again. Then, small things started to go wrong. Margaret would wake up in the morning and find the kitchen door unlocked, though she was sure she had bolted it the night before. The electricity bill came in twice as high as usual, but she couldn't find anything in the house that explained it. One afternoon, she reached for her purse to grab a few dollars for the mailman's tip and realized she was missing 20. She told herself she had simply miscounted. But doubt was creeping in, like a draft under the door. One evening, while clearing the table, she noticed Lily sitting quietly, her little hands folded in her lap. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. Lily hesitated. "Rick told me not to tell." Margaret's hands tightened around the plate she was holding. "Not to tell what?" The child looked down at her feet. Margaret knelt beside her, heart pounding. "Lily, please." After a long silence, Lily whispered, "He said you're forgetting things a lot, that maybe it's not safe for me to stay here." The plate slipped from Margaret's hands and shattered on the floor. Rick hadn't changed. He had just been waiting. Margaret sat awake long after Lily had gone to bed, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. The house was silent, but her thoughts were deafening. Rick was up to something. She knew it now. The missing money, the unlocked door. And now, worst of all, planting ideas in Lily's head. Ideas that Margaret was too old, too forgetful, too unfit to care for her own granddaughter. She had seen this before. This was how people lost everything. Margaret had heard stories about children being taken from elderly guardians, social workers stepping in, believing they were doing the right thing, a misplaced bill, a forgotten appointment, little things that, once twisted, could look like proof of incompetence. Rick had set a trap, and she had walked right into it. Her first instinct was to confront him. The next morning, she stood by the front window, waiting. Sure enough, at exactly 10 o'clock, Rick's old truck pulled into the driveway. Margaret met him on the porch before he could knock. "You've been talking to Lily," she said, her voice firm. Rick blinked, then gave her that same easygoing smile, the one she used to believe. "Of course I have. She's a great kid. She told me what you said." His smile faltered. "I was just worried, that's all. You've been misplacing things, leaving doors unlocked. It's not just about you anymore, Margaret." He gestured toward the house. She clenched her jaw. "I am not incapable. I never said you were." His tone was calm, reasonable. "But you know how these things look." He sighed, shaking his head. "People talk." Margaret's stomach twisted. People talk. Was he spreading rumors? Planting seeds in the minds of neighbors, social workers, anyone who might have the power to take Lily away? She stared at him, searching his face for the truth. But Rick had always been good at hiding his real intentions. "I think it's best if you don't come by anymore. she said, voice steady. Rick studied her for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he took a step back. If that's what you want. Margaret didn't answer. She just watched as he climbed into his truck and pulled away, gravel crunching beneath his tires. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. But that relief didn't last. 2 days later, a knock came at the door. When Margaret opened it, her stomach dropped. A woman in a gray blazer stood on the porch, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Whitmore, the woman said, offering a tight-lipped smile. I'm from Child Protective Services. We've received some concerns about the well-being of your granddaughter. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Rick wasn't finished yet. Margaret tightened her grip on the doorframe, willing her hands to stay steady. The woman from Child Protective Services glanced down at her clipboard. We received an anonymous report, she continued. Concerns about your ability to care for your granddaughter. Would you mind if I came in? Margaret's first instinct was to slam the door in her face. But that wouldn't help. It would only make her look guilty. She stepped aside, forcing a smile. Of course. The woman walked in, her sharp eyes scanning the house. Margaret had cleaned that morning, but suddenly, she saw the small imperfections. An unfolded blanket on the couch, a forgotten cup on the table, a single dish left in the sink. Would they see those as proof? Lily peeked out from the hallway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Margaret forced her voice to stay calm. It's all right, sweetheart. This lady just wants to ask a few questions. The social worker crouched down to Lily's level. Hello, dear. What's your name? Lily. How old are you? 10. The woman smiled. That's a lovely dress you're wearing. Lily shifted uncomfortably, her grip tightening on the rabbit. Thanks. Margaret's stomach churned. She had no doubt Rick had rehearsed this moment in his head, planned exactly what accusations to make. The social worker turned back to her. Do you mind if I ask a few questions? Margaret nodded, though she felt like she was suffocating. Has Lily been eating properly? Yes, of course, Margaret said quickly. She has 3 meals a day, plus snacks. The woman scribbled something on her clipboard. Have you had any difficulty remembering things? Forgetting to pay bills, leaving doors unlocked? Margaret stiffened. That's exactly what Rick told Lily. No, she said firmly. I handle everything just fine. The woman's expression didn't change. And, have you ever left Lily alone for long periods of time? Margaret's blood ran cold. Never. Another note on the clipboard. She felt like she was drowning. No matter how she answered, it wouldn't erase the doubt in the woman's mind. Finally, the social worker stood. Thank you for your time. We'll be conducting a full review. In the meantime, I suggest reaching out to any family members who might be able to support you. Margaret swallowed hard. I am her family. The woman only nodded. We'll be in touch. And just like that, she was gone. Margaret closed the door, pressing her forehead against the wood. Rick had set this in motion. He wanted to take Lily away from her. And if she didn't stop him, he was going to win. Margaret barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the social worker's face, heard the scribbling of her pen, the polite but distant tone in her voice. She had already made up her mind. Margaret could feel it. She wasn't being investigated. She was being prepared for removal. Rick had done this carefully. He had spent weeks planting doubt, feeding Lily little comments, making sure the wrong people heard the right rumors. And now, all he had to do was sit back and wait for the system to do his work for him. Margaret wouldn't let that happen. The next morning, she sat Lily down at the kitchen table, her heart heavy. Sweetheart, I need you to tell me the truth. Has Rick been saying things about me to other people? Lily fidgeted, staring at her hands. I don't know. Margaret reached across the table, gently taking her small hands in her own. It's okay, darling. I just need to understand what's going on. Lily hesitated. Then, in a small voice, she said, Rick was talking to a lady last week. She had a clipboard like the one from yesterday. Margaret's chest tightened. Did you hear what they said? Lily nodded. He told her you forget things all the time. That you left the stove on once and almost burned the house down. Her eyes darted up. But you didn't, Grandma. I know you didn't. Margaret felt sick. He was fabricating things now. And people were listening. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Sweetheart, I need you to be very careful around Rick. If he asks you questions about me, I want you to tell me, okay? Lily nodded. Are they going to take me away? The fear in her voice nearly shattered Margaret's heart. She pulled Lily into her arms, stroking her hair. No one is taking you anywhere, she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was true. After Lily went to school, Margaret knew she had no choice. She needed proof. Proof that Rick was lying. Proof that he was manipulating the system against her. She picked up the phone and dialed the only person she could think of. "Hello?" a voice answered. Margaret took a shaky breath. "Detective Reynolds? It's Margaret Whitmore. I need your help." A pause, then a sigh. "Margaret, it's been years. What's going on?" "It's Rick," she said, gripping the phone tighter. "He's back, and he's trying to take Lily away from me." Another pause. Then the detective's voice turned sharp. "Tell me everything." Margaret closed her eyes, gathering her strength. This wasn't over yet. The night before the final court hearing, the house felt heavier than ever. Every shadow stretched too far, every creak in the floor sounded like a warning. Margaret sat in her armchair, staring at the flickering light of the old lamp beside her. Lily had gone to bed, or at least Margaret thought she had. But Margaret couldn't sleep. Tomorrow, the judge would decide. Tomorrow, she could lose everything. The thought of it sent a deep ache through her chest. She had raised Lily since she was a baby. She had held her through fevers, wiped away her tears, taught her how to read, how to love, how to live. And now, because of one man's cruel vengeance, all of that could be torn away. Rick had set his trap well. The social worker's visits had become colder, more pointed. The questions had shifted from, "Can you manage?" to, "Do you think Lily is safe here?" Margaret had seen it in their eyes, doubt, hesitation. And doubt was all they needed to take her away. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. No one came this late. No one should come this late. She forced herself up, gripping the edge of the table to steady her shaking hands. Another knock, louder this time. She knew who it was before she even reached the door. Margaret hesitated only for a moment before unlocking it. And there he stood. Rick Holloway with his wolfish smirk, his cold, calculating eyes. He leaned casually against the doorframe as if he had all the time in the world. "Evening, Margaret." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "What do you want?" He said, shaking his head. "That's not very neighborly, is it? I thought after all these months we were friends again." Margaret gritted her teeth. "You and I were never friends." Rick chuckled, stepping inside without being invited. He took his time looking around, his fingers trailing across the back of the couch, the edge of the dining table. "You know," he said, "I almost admire you. You really thought you could outplay me." Margaret's fist clenched. "Get out." Rick ignored her. "You should have taken the warning, Maggie. You should have let me be." His voice dropped lower, sharper. "But instead, you had to fight back. And now, look at you." He turned, his smirk vanishing. His expression was pure venom now. "Tomorrow, the judge is going to sign those papers. And you know what happens then?" He took a step closer. "They take her away. You stay here, all alone. No one to help you, no one to believe you, no one to care." Margaret refused to let him see her cry. "You planned this," she whispered. Rick smiled. "From the moment I came back." Margaret's stomach turned. "I wanted you to feel powerless," Rick continued, his voice mocking. "Like I did when you ruined my life. I wanted you to watch as everything you love is taken away." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "And tomorrow, Maggie, you will." Margaret closed her eyes. It was over. He had won. But what Rick didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that just beyond the hallway, small hands were gripping a cell phone. And the record button had been pressed. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. The judge sat at the bench, flipping through documents. The social worker was there, her expression unreadable. And beside Margaret, Lily clutched her grandmother's hand, her tiny fingers cold and trembling. Rick sat across from them, calm, too calm. He had already won in his mind. Margaret barely heard the words being exchanged. She felt numb. The lawyer speaking on her behalf sounded distant, like an echo in a tunnel. The judge nodded along as the social worker presented her case. Margaret wasn't fit. Margaret was too old. Margaret was forgetting things. It was also carefully laid out, a neat official argument, a case already decided. Then the judge picked up his pen. The final stroke of ink that would take Lily away. Margaret's breath caught, her vision blurred. And then, wait. The small, shaking voice shattered the silence. Lily stood up. Her face was pale, her lip trembling, but her eyes burned with something fierce. "I have something to show you," she said. Rick stiffened. "Lily, sit down." But Lily didn't. She pulled her phone from her pocket. "I recorded him," she said, her voice unsteady but growing stronger. Last night, he came to our house. He said everything. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge narrowed his eyes. Play the recording. With trembling hands, Lily pressed play. Rick's voice filled the courtroom, clear as day. Tomorrow, the judge is going to sign those papers. And you know what happens then? They take her away. You stay here, all alone. No one to help you. No one to believe you. No one to care. Gasps echoed across the room. I wanted you to feel powerless, like I did when you ruined my life. I wanted you to watch as everything you love is taken away. Rick shot up from his seat. This is ridiculous. That could be fake. But it was too late. The social worker's face had gone pale. The judge leaned back in his chair, considering, and then, slowly, he set his pen down. Margaret exhaled shakily, not daring to believe it. The judge turned to the social worker. I believe this case requires further investigation. Rick's face twisted in rage. You can't do this! 2 officers stepped forward. Actually, one of them said, we can. Margaret didn't remember much after that. The relief was too overwhelming. There were voices, murmurs, movement, but all she cared about was the little girl beside her, who had saved them both. When the final decision was made, when it was official that Lily would stay with her, Margaret let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for months. Rick was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Margaret held Lily close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You were so brave, she whispered. Lily smiled, small but certain. I learned it from you, and this time, nothing would ever separate them again. The days that followed felt like a dream, one where Margaret finally woke up without fear. The threat of losing Lily was gone, and for the first time in months, their home felt safe again. Rick was facing charges for fraud and witness intimidation. Margaret didn't care to know the details. He was out of their lives, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching Lily chase fireflies in the yard, Margaret felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. Lily ran up to her, slightly out of breath. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. Do you think bad people always get what they deserve? Margaret thought for a moment. Then she smiled, pulling Lily into a warm hug. Maybe not always, she said. But sometimes the good people fight back, and that makes all the difference. As the sun set behind them, their world finally felt whole again. And this time, nothing would take that away. If you love this story and want more gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and join us for more incredible stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe now and never miss a story.